Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given. Well, welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Karen W.
And this is Brenda J. And today we have Cathy Loerzel, co-author with Dan Allender of the amazing book, Redeeming Heartache, How Past Suffering Reveals Our True Calling. Cathy is co-founder of the Allender Center in Seattle. She has her MA in counseling, psychology, and is a respected leader, instructor, and speaker. Welcome to the show, Cathy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, we're very excited for you to be here.
Continuing with part 2 of Redeeming Heartache. That's good. That's good stuff.
Yeah, and you see Jesus was very compassionate to the stranger and the widow and all that, so that makes sense. So another quote from your book, you say, as I've spent the past 16 years working with people's stories, I am more convinced than ever that healing is not about waking the chasm of suffering or grief, but about finding the faith to believe that we can sink into sorrow, plunge into the abyss, reckon with what's true, and find God there, weeping with us. That's kind of like what we're talking about. It's only there that we will find freedom, play, gratitude, and joy. And I definitely related to that part of it. So, but I know in some Christian circles, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, it's looked down on to look back or even to apply psychology to your pain. And I remember, and this was years and years ago, but I remember being reprimanded by a pastor's wife, and I brought up a book that referenced, I think it was called the book Healing for Damaged Emotions or something like that. So, so why do you think this approach, the church looks down so much on this has this approach?
Well,
that's I know. It's a big question.
What pile do I want to step in? I think ultimately it's fear, and I also think it's evil's ultimate weapon to keep us bound to harm.
Yes, I agree.
And I don't think people who are saying like, don't go to, psychologists or do this work are evil, So I want to make that caveat, but I do think that there's something whispering in us that actually is keeping us from the life that God actually has meant for us. And not just so that we're happy or fulfilled. Like, I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that we're people who can handle the pain and the suffering of the world in a way where we can still like sink into those biggest places of despair, not flinch, grieve, and have the capacity to grieve with those who are grieving, just like the Beatitudes. I think that's for me the crux of this is if we're going to be a people who can grieve with those who are grieving and laugh with those who are laughing and mourn with those who are, then we have to have all those emotions available to us.
Yeah.
Those emotions are not available to us if we have not gone back and kind of rescued and healed those stories where we decided back then that emotion was bad. We didn't want to feel that anymore, and we were going to shut it down.
Yeah.
So I think it is wild to me that as Christians, we think, that you can have. So I always talk about it on a scale, like there's a Richter scale or 0 to -5, a 0 to +5. And we feel like we want a +5 joy. And we're like, we're going to be joyful people who are feeling joy and goodness and love and healing. But I believe that you cannot have a +5 unless you're willing to have a -5. So unless you're willing to feel the worst grief, the heartache and agony of our past, you're willing to lean into that. You're to the degree. So if you're only willing to feel a -2 before you say, okay, I'm done, you're only going to be able to feel a +2.
Interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it.
And I did know I do struggle with certain emotions. I'll be like, why does that person have that emotion like so easily? And I just struggle with it. Yeah. I didn't really understand that till this podcast now.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Serious.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I think that's the thing about integration, right? And that's so that we can be a people who can be with other people. Like, I love when you really look at the way that Jesus healed. He went in and didn't redeem people's sin. He healed their bodies. He healed their emotions and said, you're loved. Like, I see you, I understand your story. And he was able to like feel the things that they were feeling with them. Yeah. And then be able to bring healing into those moments. If you refuse to feel grief or sorrow or suffering or despair, you're never going to be able to connect with someone else who's feeling those emotions because you're terrified of those emotions in your own life. You know, and so when someone comes to you and says, oh, I feel a lot of despair around this thing that's happening in my life, and you're like, I refuse to feel despair. I will only feel hope. Just keep going, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just get it done. If you're that sort of person, when someone comes to you with that despair, you're going to dismiss it and you're going to give them solutions. You're going to say, okay, let's make a game plan. Let's get you out of this. Let's move.
Interesting.
Well, that leaves that person in the dust and you're actually not connecting and attuning to what they need. But that's because in your own life, that's how you've had to survive.
Yeah.
And you don't recognize that we're not actually going to be the people I think Jesus and God calls us to be, which are healers and connectors and people who are tuned to one another and can bring love to the world. And we can't do that if we have certain emotions that are difficult and off limits in our own lives.
Yeah, I don't know if it was in the book or because I also been listening to the Place We Find Ourselves, podcast. I've been like during COVID, I binge listened to that podcast. But I don't know if it was from the podcast or from the book, but he says you can only take people so far as you're willing to go yourself, which is kind of that same concept of what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I find it what's odd is I struggle with anger. Like I struggle with being angry.
Like feeling anger?
Yeah, like feeling anger.
Yeah.
Which is surprising me. I'm like, okay, I'm angry. Like I can't really do it. Anyway, I guess that's okay. I'll work out that on my own time. This quote is really appropriate for the time we are living in. Disassociation provides disconnection, intolerable reality, internal and or external, and reconnection to a mechanism that is mental and or physical and feels more within our control. Can you describe some common ways we tend to disassociate?
Oh man. Yeah. So I'll take it out of the ones that are, we kind of know like TV or screens, things like that. Yeah. So for me, when I feel out of control and dysregulated in my body, I want to then control my external world. And so when I all of a sudden feel scared or unsure about something that's coming or have a lot of anxiety, I'll start to clean. I'll start to organize closets. I'll start to get angry about my family and the fact that they are making too many messes and I can't keep up with the amount of mess, right? So I'll start to kind of blame and bring my anger towards them. Like that doesn't seem like dissociation, but it is.
Interesting.
Right? Because what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, I can't bear what's going on inside my body. So I need to find a way to regulate my anxiety outside of my body and my environment. And again, you can do that through just flipping through your phone or watching TV or moving to work. Like the other thing that I'll do is that if I feel anxious, I'm like, well, I'm going to get a plan. I'm going to write it out. I'm going to write a new proposal. I'm going to write a new thing. And then we're going to figure this out. And so again, that doesn't seem to us like dissociation, but it's actually moving me away from what I'm actually anxious and afraid about. And I'm unwilling to stay with those emotions long enough to tend to them, to drop into my body and say, oh, I wonder why I'm dysregulated. What just happened? Why am I feeling so upset and anxious and spun out? Like instead of staying with that long enough and tolerating those emotions to get down to the bottom of them, I hit the ejector seat, fly out, and then go to my external world and actually create a lot of chaos in my attempt to create order. Right?
So interesting.
I always hit the ejector seat.
Yes.
I do.
Eject. Get out of here.
Not deal with this today.
No, and that's so common, right? And so there's also not shame. Like I don't say that to say, now every time you hit the ejector seat, you have to feel like, oh, I'm, not doing my work. But it's something to be curious about.
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
Figure out what's going on here.
Yeah. So I need to hit this. These are the moments where the ejector seat feels real good. Because this plane's going down and mama doesn't want to be on it when it does, right?
Need to get out of here.
Yes.
And I love Dan's example in the book. He talked about like little T trauma that triggered abandonment in him. He shares about walking into a Starbucks. He says used to be his home away from home, from the school. And then he saw several of his colleagues at a table, and it was just a look that triggered his abandonment. Now I can relate to this. He says someone mentioned he could squeeze in, but the eyes told a different story. So he shares how he felt unwanted and foolish and says, and this is a quote from him, I declined, chatted for a moment about the weather, tucked my tail between my legs, and waited for the barista to serve my coffee. Other memories of abandonment crowded into my mind, and my head was as noisy as the shop around me. Our one inner voice said, retaliate. Another quietly urged me to consider their situation. You child, I thought to myself, and the impulse to make light of it finally won the day. So it was just that inner turmoil decreased. And he said he felt something in his heart turned cold. Mm-hmm. And so this just shows us something so insignificant about just going in and seeing somebody react a certain way we can tell a story even with that. Mm-hmm. And he shared later on in the book how that, that ended up being like an envy issue that he had to deal with. But can you share how our imagination to construct scenarios is linked to our traumas? That's kind of an example of that.
Yeah, this does kind of go back to even the moment of me wanting to clean the house, right? So if we really pay attention, we have lots of moments where something is kind of triggered in us. And I don't mean the triggered word like, you're having a panic attack or, but something gets elevated in our body where we're like, oh, that didn't feel good. Mm-hmm. And I feel sad. Well, and let me take a step back. So at first you hear that didn't feel good. And then you try to figure out how to fix it, right? And so, because, our automatic impulse isn't to stay in the feeling of like, that really hurt my feelings. Our impulse is to figure out how to get ourselves out of it.
Right.
And how to make it better, right? And that, gosh, I'm thinking of like, there are several stories that are swirling around in my own mind of times where that's happened for me. But the thing that I've had to do is then take a moment to let it sink in. So like if Dan had been in a different space, for him to have been able to recognize like, I'm sad. I really feel rejected. I actually have a lot of longing to belong. Mm-hmm. I actually want to be invited into that table and I'm not.
Yeah.
And that is sad. And so, but what he's then inviting his own heart to is so risky because for him, it's going to be easier for him to say like, well, I didn't want to sit at the table anyways, or, mm-hmm. Or they're just, going through their own stuff. Like you're dismissing to keep yourself from feeling like, oh, what's most painful is that I actually wanted to be invited.
Yeah.
And I wasn't. And so now I feel foolish and I feel unwanted. And now I have to deal with my own grief and sadness, and it pricks every other story you have in your life where that's also been true.
Yeah.
And we don't want to feel that.
Yeah.
And so we'll spin out and do whatever we need to do. But again, you take more energy trying to talk yourself out of the emotion than you do if you actually allow yourself to sink in, let yourself feel it, recognize why it's painful, maybe cry.
Yeah.
And let it out. Maybe go talk to someone and say, this thing happened. It was really hard. Our bodies can move through those moments and actually release those moments in a healthy way. But we have to be able to acknowledge what's actually happening in those moments to allow the trauma or the heartache to move through our bodies. Our bodies and minds are capable of letting those things go. Like we could, but you can't actually let it move through your body if you're just dismissing or trying to override the feeling that you're actually having in the moment. Does that make sense?
But it felt feelings that he was feeling, he could have kind of quickly got through it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just have the type of temperament where I would just walk in there and not even care what any of them are thinking. And I think that's bad too, because I probably actually do care, but I just don't want to deal with it. So I just don't care because I don't want to even bother with it.
Absolutely. And that's the stranger wounds. The stranger is like, well,
that's what I am. Oh,
yeah. I'm not even going to care because your power comes from not having to care about it. And therefore they never get to you. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's wow. Okay. Will you share in the book about your experience of going to a family member's Episcopalian church as a kid a church that was foreign to you, and how embarrassed you felt in trying to fit in when they did communion. You say the feeling of being a stranger in a strange land, exposed and humiliated, was terrifying. And I know one thing for sure, I never wanted to feel it again. You say that it was one of the many experiences that bound your heart to perfection and avoiding humiliation, and to maybe honor self-protection over authenticity. Can you share how our desire to always belong can bind us to heartache, and how it did that for you? We kind of talked about this a little bit already, didn't we?
Similar.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, we long to belong. It's the story that we just talked about with Dan. For me being in that church, what I saw were a big group of people who all belonged.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the feeling of like not knowing what was coming next, not knowing how to act correctly, not knowing how to say the right thing, do the right thing. And the pressure that I then felt in my own body was like, you need to now be hyper vigilant and always looking around the next corner to make sure that you're never caught unaware. Right. And so that sort of thing is exhausting. And so for those of us who are bound to perfectionism or always knowing what's coming next, you can't rest because you're always waiting for the next moment that's going to have a potential setup for humiliation. I felt the same way when I had my first baby. This is weird, but I have two kids, an 8 and a 6-year-old. And when I had my 8-year-old, I was not prepared for having a baby. And I remember feeling like, well, people have babies all the time, so I should just know how to do this. And every moment was new. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to nurse. Even just things like collapsing and opening up a stroller. Like, I don't know if you've done that lately, but it is
pretty complicated.
I was like watching all these other moms being like, I don't know how to do this. And I have like a newborn who's crying and I barely made it out of the house and I don't know what to pack in this bag. And I was like, I
got the memo, but you're like,
oh, it is humiliating. And I had to fight that all the time where I was like, this is awful. And what I did in my own body was like shut down and say like, I can't do this. It's too much. And I'm never leaving the house again.
I remember thinking, I can't, this is they trust me to take this baby home?
Yeah.
Oh,
I thought in the hospital, like, this is my responsibility and they're trusting me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that a beautiful thing and a terrifying thing.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time.
It is a lot.
And you have no clue with the first baby. None.
Yeah.
No,
and no one talks about that. They're like, you're going to be fine. You're like, how? How exactly are we going to be fine?
Well, I remember because my firstborn was only 5 pounds something ounces, but because I had to vacuum him out of me, he bruised my tailbone. And I remember being in the waiting room and I was like, I had to like gently like sit down and I was looking around at all the other women. I'm like, how are they just sitting down so easily? Even something like that. I'm like, I can't sit down like that.
No. Yeah. And I think we all have those moments, right? Where we realize like, I don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
And depending on the story is going to be how well you handle those moments and how much you just try to pull yourself up by your bootstrap, or if you actually can allow yourself to feel the fear and the terror of like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I feel alone and isolated and terrified. But those emotions are hardly ever really allowed in our world, especially when we feel like they're things that we should just know how to handle.
Yeah. So I love this quote from your book. It says, we want you to be willing to struggle with what has broken your heart, but far more, we want you to be amazed by what your story can enable you to create. There is a way to move from harm to hope, from trauma to healing. Your deepest losses are the context in which you become your true self. There's freedom and joy in living well in a broken world with complex people for a purpose far greater than you can ever imagine. And each of us is meant for this. The greater good uniquely crafted our story that reveals more of God's glory. So you talk about having hidden knowledge in our heart that we have to come to trust. Anything more you want to share about that?
Oh, I think it goes back to the idea that so much of the redemption is having the availability of all of our emotions all together for the glory of God. And I think that's the hope and the promise. And it's not to be redeemed in the sense of you don't feel pain anymore, or you don't understand suffering, or you're living like a joyful and happy life. I think the world's a mess. It always has been a mess. It always will be a mess. So then who are we called to be able to handle it in a way that brings comfort and goodness and healing to those around us?
Yeah, that's perfectly said.
Yeah. So I think that's the hope.
Yeah.
And you can't do that if you're not settled in your own body. If you're still fighting your story and fighting what's true and, not willing to admit so many of our shadow parts or our secrets or the things that we wish weren't true, we're held captive. And the hope of this work is that we experience the freedom and the delight that comes. And then our presence on this earth won't be afraid of pain. We won't be afraid of sorrow. We won't be Pollyanna about it. We're going to sit there, but we will have a deeper capacity to weep and to grieve and to also then feel the unbound delight and joy that is available to us, but not without also acknowledging harm and suffering.
Yeah, that's very beautifully said.
Very beautiful. Yeah. Very beautifully said. Wow. So Dan or you share in the book that John Gottman, a marriage therapist and researcher, has been able to predict divorce with 93.6% accuracy. He does so primarily on the basis of the presence or absence of contempt. Contempt destroys a marriage like poison because it demeans the other while simultaneously solidifying one's power as judge and jury. This is usually present in abusive relationships. You say a stranger is called to be a prophet. The role of our prophet is to warn and wake up, but is seldom heard. Can you share how prophets wrestle with powerlessness, loneliness, and foolishness?
Yeah. So the premise of the book is looking at the orphan, stranger, and widow wounds, and then what happens when those things get healed. So, and you guys, you can read about this in the book, but when the orphan is healed, it moves into the category of priest. When a stranger is healed, they move into the category of prophet. And when a widow is healed, they move into the category of king and queen. And priest, prophet, and king and queen are really the three stations that scripture often talks about in terms of the leadership and the way that we operate in the world. And Jesus is then seen as the perfect prophet, priest, and king. That's how he's described in scripture. And so that's a complicated way to say, so the prophet is the redemptive arc of the stranger, because again, the stranger sees what's wrong with the world. And the stranger has deep heartache because it seems like no one is willing to do anything about it. And so the prophet will often struggle because in that powerlessness, we were talking about this with your own story, right? When you feel that powerlessness, you're often like, well, you're all dead to me. We're not going to do this anymore. I don't care. I can't give you, any more of my ideas or my heart. So a prophet will often, in an unhealed place, be like, just burn it all down. I can't care about this anymore. You guys aren't listening. And so the prophet then gets filled with contempt, with self-righteousness, and also a sense of indifference for what's going on around them. But that really comes from that there's so much pain and heartbreak underneath because they actually are the seers of such beauty and goodness and have such deep desire and longing for redemption. And healing. And so a prophet almost goes mad in the midst of what they see unless they're willing to kind of acknowledge, okay, I need to settle my body. I need to acknowledge that I'm going to feel deeper heartache than other people. And that's going to be really painful. And so I need to be around beauty more. I need to have more rest and delight in my world to feel like the world's worth fighting for. And so there's a lot that goes into being a prophet that's important for those who feel like they're more in that category.
Yeah, I would say I can totally relate to what you're saying right now.
I know. I can too. I think that's more my area too, but I can relate to all of them, but it's also insightful. So I love how you share a personal story on teaching on Hagar and how you had a new insight as to how desperate Hagar was when she cried out to God. And I love Hagar's story personally because it's just that story of validation. And God, I just had this, to me, it was like a supernatural experience where I felt like God just let me know that he saw my pain. I was in an abusive marriage for a long time. And that was just a really wake up moment. So I've always really related to her. And Hagar was a widow. She was abused and discarded. So can you share how allowing yourself to feel the fear of loss and death in your situation with the Allender Center, because you were saying that you had that insight when you were getting ready to speak about that, how that was an insight for you.
Yeah. And the story of Hagar is so profound. And I think to see her pain and her suffering, but also being pushed out the city gates, she had done everything that was asked of her.
Right.
And she birthed another baby. She had still wrestled with her place, and really she was a slave, and yet in this bizarre position of power and also not power. I mean, her story is profound to me, but I think what I love about that story is how honest she is when she puts Isaac underneath a bush. So she gets pushed out of the camp because Sarah now has Ishmael. So Sarah now has Isaac and she has Ishmael, and her and Ishmael get pushed out of the camp. And it's a death warrant. They're pushing her out to go die.
Yeah.
And I think we can all relate to that of like, you've done everything that's been asked of you. And in the end, you still get pushed out the gate to certain death.
Yeah.
And then that's where God meets her, right? But it's only after she pushed Ishmael under a bush to die, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because she can't bear his screaming.
Yeah, she doesn't want to see him die.
She doesn't see him die. And I look at that and I'm like, I get that. To suffer the anguish of death and heartache and stay is too much for the human soul. And I love that she actually honors that in her own body, even if it's awful. And she goes, it says an arrow's throw away, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where she can't really hear him. And that is where God comes and meets her, is when she's so deeply broken and so deeply human. And she's weeping and Ishmael is weeping. And then God comes and says, I will redeem you and create a nation through your lineage, right? And so I love the fact that like God is a God that doesn't just redeem the story of Sarah and Abraham. Mm-hmm. He redeems the story of a discarded slave, enslaved woman, right? Yeah. But God recognizes the horror of what she's been through and honors and brings her back to life and gives her water. Yeah. And so I think there's something so hopeful in that, because so many of us find ourselves really in the barren desert, either emotionally in our own lives, the loss of family, the loss of marriages, the loss of children, the loss of jobs, loss of communities. I mean, this has been a season of tremendous death and loss. Yes. And for so many of us, we're actually, if we're more honest, we're actually where Hagar is. We just don't want to recognize it.
Yeah.
And that is where God finds us. And I love that.
I do too.
Yeah.
I love how he sees her. He sees her pain.
Yeah, that was very touching. Okay. I need to, I was a little feeling emotion for a second there. Yeah. Wow. That's good stuff. Okay. Your book shares how we are all widowed in some way, whether it's losing a spouse to divorce or death or having a child that succumbs to addiction. The book says we are healed through embracing her calling to serve God's kingdom with humility and courage as a king or a queen. Can you expound on that a little?
Yeah. So the widow's call is really to risk loving again. So you even looking at Hagar's story, right? Her call is to bring her heart back to life, to drink the water of life once again, and then go rebuild that. And for a widow who has known death, who has known abuse, who's known horror, to then be able to even the act of drinking again and like replenishing yourself, and then the risk of loving and being loved again and building. That is the call of the king and queen. The call of the queen is to create the kingdoms that the people will flourish in. Mm-hmm. And you can't create boundaries and create goodness and structures. And, even if it's just in the form of a lovely meal at a table, you can't create that way unless you are willing to love again and risk death and be loved by other people, both of which will feel so risky for a widow, but that is the calling.
Yeah. And
so I love the fact that the widow has to kind of face her own fear and face the fact that death is actually inevitable. Yeah. Everything that you love and create in this world will die.
Yeah.
Even if it's a beloved podcast or the Allender Center organization, my life cycle within the Allender Center will shift and change, and I will have something else to build in a different season. The idea that we can build something, love something, and that it's just always going to be there isn't true.
Yeah.
And so we have to come to grips with the fact that it will all die. So how do we become people who can bear death without erasing it or diminishing it, to feel the grief of it all, and then rise up, drink water again, and then build a new nation? That's what we're called to do.
Yeah. And I don't know, in that story, I just can't help thinking about, would she have been able to do that had God not really shown her, like validated her. That's the beauty of the story is like she, seeing like God sees me. I'm not invisible,
That's huge when you know that God sees you.
Right.
And what you've been through.
For me, it was huge.
Yeah, it's big. It's big.
Yeah.
It is huge. Yeah.
So it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance. When you've been abused, shame is attached to that. Truth allows us to come to our child self and to honor what is true and offer kindness to our wounds. The damage can be redeemed. I mean, that's the whole theme of the book. Redemption is a flourishing of who we are to become. Is this why you think evil is so good at keeping us from addressing our heartaches? We kind of touched on this a little bit too, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the greatest thing of evil would be to keep us from that which actually can heal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Dan says we must be serious students of ourselves, open to the healing and heartache of the hope that resounds in our lives. A refusal to engage trauma inevitably clouds our self-awareness and makes us prone to defend when we are meant to repent. Self-awareness is huge. Anything you'd want to add to that?
Amen.
I know.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's the key. Again, it's not like we just want you to be happy or navel gazing. It's actually a deeper, holy calling to understand your own stories so you can bring healing and goodness to the world, and that you can do that with an awareness and an integrity that you won't be able to do if you don't understand who you are and where you've come from.
Yeah.
That's so good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of the whole book and all the work that you guys do. So I'm going to end with one last quote. And it was hard to narrow it down because there were so many good quotes in this book. But the quote I'm going to end with, it says, I believe each of us can work best for the kingdom by addressing human suffering in light of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. His death invites us to engage our victimization and our violence against the ultimate picture of sacrificial love. His willingness to suffer our shame takes the weight of it off our shoulders. The resurrection assures us that our shame has been devoured and death will not have the last word. The grave could not hold Jesus, and decay and death are not our destiny. The resurrection is a down payment on a hope that reveals the larger truth about the world, others, and ourselves beyond despair and powerlessness and into anticipation and praise. So I know we covered a lot. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was such a deeply personal one for me because this book I was telling Brendan, I'm like, this is on my top 5 favorite books because it's one I know I'm going to keep and, read over again because it's such deep material that I want to get it because everything you're saying just makes so much sense. So,
I actually think I need this book. I don't know if there's much out there to help me with my issues.
Yeah. I mean,
all these things with the defragmenting and the fragmentation and yes, this is awesome. Well, how can our listeners find out more about the Allender Center and what it offers and also to find you on social media?
Sure. Yeah. So you go to theallendercenter.org and you can find all of our upcoming offerings, and Redeeming Heartache is on tour right now. And so we're heading to a couple different cities this fall, including St. Louis and Colorado again and Atlanta. So you can take a look and see if we're coming to your area. And then you can
Arizona.
Oh, we would love it. Invite us. We'll come. Yeah.
I'll have to look at that going.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's really fun to share this work on the road and get back to seeing people. And then you can find me on Instagram at Cathy.Loerzel. We're loving this work and we're just going to continue to do it as long as we have favor within the kingdom.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. I just love the hope-filled message of it, that it's not like you're saying, it's not just looking back to look back. There's a purpose in it, very redemptive purpose in it all.
Absolutely.
Yes. Well, thank you. I know we took up a lot of your time, so I appreciate
thank you
it.
so
I wanted
much.
to cover so much because there was so much.
Absolutely.
It was amazing.
Nice to be with you too. Thank you so much.
And next time I'll see you when I'm not just gotten out of the shower. But
I look forward to it.
I knew that you'd only be able to see one of us, so it worked out fine.
Sorry, guys. Can you hear my kids screaming?
No, I can't hear it at all.
Okay. Great.
This one's going to be like Sarah McDougal's, huh? I had to piece hers all back together. She had a train go by like 4 times, and her kids. I know. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we could start at the end of that question, and then I'll start over. So I think they're okay. I mean, I hear screaming and gnashing, but I think they're going to be fine. Okay.
Yeah, we're not hearing it on our end anyway.
Great.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.